All right, you're going to be viewing a lecture on the first presidents of the United States. It's also going to be the beginning of our political parties. We have our new constitution, we had our legislative branch, our judicial system, and we want to talk about some of our first presidents of the United States and how they influenced our government and our nation. So the first president we know is George Washington. He's going to serve for 8 years, basically elected 1789, and he's going to serve 2 terms until 1797. He could have served more than 2 terms, but he opted to spend time with his family and his wife at Mount Vernon. So when he took office, the country was already $50 million in debt because of the American Revolution, and we had no way under the Articles of Confederation of making an income. He asked Alexander Hamilton for help, and Alexander Hamilton is going to become our Secretary of Treasury. He is going to hopefully come in and help stabilize the nation's economy. And one of the first things he did was the federal government took on states' debts as well as any national debt. So a couple things that happened. Bonds were issued, kind of like the war bonds we had talked about previously. You could buy a certificate and it would collect interest, but it was a way for the government to earn money. We moved the capital down south. The capital was going to move to the Potomac River between Virginia and Maryland because we wanted it to be more central amongst the states. Now, we're not going to make the final move from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. until 1800. So unfortunately, the President Washington is going to die in 1799 and actually miss the move completely to D.C. Our national bank is going to be established, and this was going to be a way to stabilize our nation's credit, to give credit out to the American public. And under Alexander Hamilton, too, we're going to have the elastic clause, which basically meant that the government could make all laws that they deem were necessary and proper. So going back a little bit to the national bank, it's going to cause a little bit of controversy over state rights. It's going to hold, for a variety of reasons, but some of the major reasons, it's going to hold federal deposits. It's going to loan money to the government. It's going to be able, and the government's going to use that to build roads, to build bridges, to build factories. We're trying to get our economy going. And it's going to be the first time that we're going to issue paper money. That's going to be backed by gold deposits. So the national bank is actually going to do a lot for our country. It's going to help our country's economic survival. So like I said, the president is going to serve 2 terms, and he's going to basically retire from politics. Now, one of the first things in office that George Washington was faced with, besides our economy being down, is going to be the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion is basically going to happen because in 1791, a bill is going to be passed that's going to tax all liquor made and sold in our nation. Now, farmers in Western Pennsylvania were pretty upset because they could make huge profits from the making and the selling of their whiskey, and they weren't taxed. So when this was made, they were going to start being taxed. They rebelled. In 1794, a rebellion is going to break out, and Washington is going to order 13,000 militia to maintain order. A lot of people were unsure what the federal government was going to do at this point, but he did set a precedent during this time that the federal government was going to take a stand. The other thing that he did is George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, they went out with the militia. We're not going to see presidents traveling out today, but they actually did go out to assert that government power and that they were going to collect taxes. Now, our second president is going to be John Adams, and John Adams was actually the vice president under George Washington. He is going to be a one-term president. He's going to actually lose the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson. John Adams is a Federalist, and they're going to lose some power because the Democratic Republicans are becoming a lot stronger. So a couple of things that happened during his administration The first one being the XYZ affair. And the XYZ affair occurred because France was bullying the United States out at sea. And there were three French agents who were known as X, Y, and Z: Jean Hottinger, Pierre Bellamy, and Lucien Hauterol, who wanted money when the U.S. sent officials to negotiate. Adams did release the report that we were being bullied and we were trying to, the French were trying to blackmail us. So when he released the report, there was a lot of anti-French sentiments in the United States. So it was kind of that undeclared war with the French. Another thing he did was pass and sign into law the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. This is going to be one of the first times we're going to see immigration restricted, and it's going to allow the president to expel any illegal aliens in the United States. It also is going to limit our freedom of speech because it's going to prohibit the rights of people to criticize the government. Sedition basically means conduct or language that's inciting rebellion against authority. So anyone that didn't agree with the United States, they couldn't make that, they didn't have the right to voice their opinions or their concern. So some states actually didn't agree with this act. And because of the Alien and Sedition Acts, it was one of the reasons that John Adams lost the presidency, because people didn't support it. The Federalist Party also wasn't very unified at this time. And Thomas Jefferson was becoming a lot more popular. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to win the election of 1800. He is going to be the third president of our country, and he is a Democratic Republican. Now, a little bit about Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Federalists thought that the people needed government because they were naturally selfish and that they needed someone to make decisions for them. They favored the rich and the well-born. They wanted those people to rule. They thought that they could make the best decisions. And the Democratic Republicans were pretty much the opposite. They believed that people were naturally good and that they could handle self-government, that they could make decisions on their own. They favored the common man. And so Thomas Jefferson is going to be our first Democratic Republican president, and we are going to see Democratic Republicans for quite a long time. So one of the first things he did is he repealed the Alien and Sedition Acts. He didn't feel that he felt that they were going against the Constitution and that they weren't fair to legally limit our freedom of speech. Now, one case, one of the first cases that's going to come up in the Supreme Court is going to be a case called Marbury versus Madison. What happened here is before John Adams left office, he appointed about 40 federal judges. William Marbury was one of them. These judges are going to be known as the Midnight Judges. At the point after the election, John Adams is going to remain president for about 2 months, but it's a lame duck presidency. They're not going to really make a lot of decisions. However, he did appoint about 40 not Supreme Court judges, but federal judges. So William Marbury was appointed a federal judge at the very end of John Adams' term. James Madison is going to be appointed Secretary of State under Jefferson's presidency, and he is supposed to sign off once he takes office on all these judges. James Madison refused to give most of these federal judges papers. One of the reasons the Democratic Republicans did not want all these federal judges appointed to office because they were Federalists. They had differing opinions. The federal judges were going to be appointed for 5 years, but they didn't want differing opinions in the judicial branch. So Madison refuses to give Marbury the papers that would make him an official judge. And Marbury actually sued Madison, hence the name of the case, Marbury versus Madison. Now, it's going to work its way up through the court system. It's going to make its way all the way to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court is going to decide not to hear the case because of the Judiciary Act of 1789. They felt that it was an unfair act and it violated the Constitution. And because of that, because they deciding the constitutionality of the Judiciary Act, they decided not to hear the case. So what that means is Madison does not have to give Marbury his papers. Now, this case, though, is going to be the first time that the Supreme Court uses judicial review. The court's ruling, like I said, not to hear the case, meant that Marbury could not be a judge. A couple other things that's going to happen during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. He is going to make the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase is going to include some land in Florida that's going to be taken from Spain. The cost, it's going to cost the United States about $15 million, which is approximately about $3 per acre. We bought the land from France. And then the last thing that's going to happen, not the last thing that's going to happen during Thomas Jefferson's, but one of the biggest highlights during his presidency is the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this is where we're going to explore land out west. We do explore some of the new Louisiana territory we have, but Lewis and Clark really is going to explore more than 6,000 miles of this newly acquired territory. We are exploring because of commerce reasons. We wanted to make claims to the Oregon Territory. We knew the British were over there, so we wanted to make some of those claims in that territory as well. And we wanted to create friendly relations with some of the Native American tribes that were living out west. One Native American that really did have an impact and helped us a lot was Sacagawea, who was a Shoshone Indian. And the other thing we wanted to do is we wanted to see what was out there. So we made detailed notes about languages that were spoken, some of the geography, the plants, the animals. And we were able to take some specimens and test them when we got back as well. So it really did help as far as exploring the vast United States. The Embargo Act is not on your notes, but it is something that kind of was the downfall of Thomas Jefferson. He signed this into law, and basically what that meant is all exports, you could not export any, they were all illegal. So we could not have any goods leaving our country. One of the reasons he signed it was because he wanted to make sure the British didn't have a lot of goods and services traded with us. Now, with the Embargo Act, it did upset a lot of people because it did affect a lot of their businesses. So it's one of his demise as the presidency. He could have run for a third term. He actually decided not to because he did sign the Embargo Act into law. So our next president is going to be James Madison. He is the Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson. He is also known as the father of our Constitution for his impact in the drafting of the Constitution. He is going to be a two-term president. He is a Democratic Republican. He's going to defeat Charles Pinckney in 1808. And the major event that happens during his presidency is the War of 1812. Madison was being pressured by the war hawks, which basically meant people that favored war against Great Britain in Congress, to declare war on Britain. There was a lot of tension with Britain because of the territory situation out west. And so eventually what ends up happening is Madison does declare war on Great Britain in 1812. A lot of people were nervous because we hadn't fought in a war since the American Revolution, and we weren't sure how prepared we were going to be. We weren't concentrating too much on our national defense at this time. We were trying to help our economy and grow our nation. So there were a lot of war hawks who saw that going to war was an advantage. A lot of people thought that Great Britain was aiding Native Americans out west, and Native Americans were attacking some of the settlers on the western frontier. So there weren't a lot of battles in this war, but what ended up happening is the United States proved once again that it was strong enough to battle one of the most powerful countries in the world. This war is going to be a big deal, not only for the United States, but also in Europe, because European countries didn't know how well our country actually was doing. They didn't know how this new government was functioning. So it really was a success for us. There's also going to be a convention that takes place in Hartford. The Hartford Convention basically was, at this point, there was a time where the New England colonies, the states, thought that they wanted to secede from the Union. They ended up not seceding from the Union. And we also are going to have the Treaty of Ghent that is basically going to end the War of 1812. And there's a picture of James Madison. Now, our next president after James Madison is going to be James Monroe. James Monroe is a Democratic Republican, and he's going to be a two-term president. And during this time, we had this era of good feeling. There was a lot of good things that were happening. Our economy at one point was on an upswing until the Panic of 1819, which is going to be one of our country's first economic recessions. It's not a depression. We didn't lose everything, but it was a dip in our nation's economy. And when that dip occurs, it does affect the American public. So we were able to recover from this rather quickly, and we got back to that era of good feeling. Now, one of the major events that's going to happen during James Monroe's presidency, he is going to sign into law the Monroe Doctrine. If we look at the physical geography of the world, the Americas, including North and South America, Central America, we are in the Western Hemisphere. And we had a big fear that the European countries were going to try to take over some already established colonies or try to expand their colonies in the Americas. Now, we don't have control of any of the colonies in Central or South America, and we just were thinking that European countries were getting too close for comfort. So what the Monroe Doctrine said and what it did was the United States, we weren't going to interfere with any European colonies that have already been established in the Western Hemisphere. So any countries in Europe that had established colonies in the Western Hemisphere, they were allowed to keep. What it did warn against, though, is any European countries coming in and establishing new colonies. If anything, new colonies were going to be established, we were going to view that as an act of aggression against the United States, and there was going to be that threat of war. We're going to see more things add to the Monroe Doctrine, but basically we wanted the European countries to stay out of the United States. We are going to see, in 1820, we're going to see the Missouri Compromise going to be signed into law, and this is going to try to keep the balance between slave and free states, and we're going to talk more about that when we talk about the Civil War. So there's a picture of James Monroe. And after James Monroe, we're going to have John Quincy Adams, who is the son of John Adams. He's also going to be the Secretary of State under Madison, and he is a Democratic Republican. And he's going to be a one-term president. There was an interesting thing about this election, and there's not a whole lot going on in the United States at this time, but we basically are going to see the 1824 election. It's going to be a race between four candidates. You're going to have John Quincy Adams, and you're also going to have Andrew Jackson, who's from Tennessee. They are both going to be Democratic Republicans. You're going to have the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and you're going to have the Secretary of Treasury, William Crawford, run. So when you have more than two candidates, it's very difficult for someone to get the majority of the popular vote or the majority of the Electoral College vote. Now, under the 12th Amendment, if no one receives the majority of the Electoral College vote, the House of Representatives will decide the presidency. So Andrew Jackson actually won the popular vote, but not one candidate received the majority of the Electoral College vote. Now, because of that, the House of Reps were able to decide. They took the top three candidates, the top three vote getters, which was John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Secretary of Treasury William Crawford. Henry Clay was left out, and they were able to choose the next president. They chose John Quincy Adams as the next president. They thought with his father's background, with him being the Secretary of State under Madison, that he was the best fit. It's going to cause a rift in the Democratic Republican Party because Andrew Jackson is going to be rather upset that he did not receive the nomination and the presidency. So again, during the 1828 election, you're going to see John Quincy Adams going to lose to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is going to be a Democrat. We're going to see a new political party. He is going to be a two-term president. He is very tough. He's going to be the first president that's born west of the Appalachian Mountains. He's going to be born in a log cabin, and he's a commoner. He's not he's not rich. He's not well-born. He's going to be known as King Jackson, also Old Hickory, because he was born west of the Appalachian Mountains. He's from Tennessee, like I said. But he is going to rule, which a lot of people are going to have problems with, kind of like a king. Now, his goal when he was running for president was to get people involved in government. He wanted the everyday man. He just didn't want the rich and the well-born. He thought that the everyday common man could make good decisions as well. He did fight in the Revolutionary War, and he saw some battle in the War of 1812. So like I said, he did start the Democratic Party. He helped to start the Democratic Party in 1828. And because of his goal, by the 1830s, more and more people were participating in government. If it wasn't involvement as running for office, they were voting. Now, something he did establish in his presidency was the spoils system, and it was the kitchen cabinet. Instead of appointing people based on their merit, he appointed friends. And a lot of people didn't think that they made the best decisions, and it was good for the government. So the spoils system, basically, you're going to appoint people based on who you know, not on how well they would do the job or their merit. A couple other things he did is he challenged the use of nullification, and this is where the states sometimes wouldn't agree with a federal law, so they would try to nullify. And South Carolina was one of the first to try to nullify federal laws, and he challenged that. He felt that the federal government or federal laws should be over state government or state laws. Now, he did not like Native Americans, and he was very anti-Indian, and he didn't think that they should have the same rights as citizens of the United States. So what he started was something called the Indian Removal Act. It was passed in 1830, and we're going to see it last throughout his presidency. Basically, what happened here is Native Americans are going to be forced to give up their land, and they're going to be forced to land out west of the Mississippi River. By 1840, over 60,000 Native Americans had been forced to move, which was almost half of the Native American population that's going to be living east of the Mississippi. Mostly affected of these Native Americans living in the South, it's going to be 5 tribes: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole Nations. The walk that the Native Americans had to endure, it's going to be known as the Trail of Tears. There's a lot of disease, famine, a lot of lives that are going to be lost. When they did travel out west, they were supposed to go to Oklahoma. The problem with Oklahoma is there's no fertile soil. They were promised help from the government, and they did not receive any help. So Andrew Jackson, there was a strong contingent of the United States public that liked him. There were people, though, that did not agree with the notion of how he treated Native Americans. So we're actually going to stop there today. We are going to discuss the beginnings of our political parties and take a closer look at some of their beliefs during class. Please bring your spiral notebook, your composition book. You are going to have, based on the lecture, you're going to have a journal entry. So thanks for listening and thanks for viewing, and I will see you in class.